Hey everyone, today I'm going to read a book proposal I'm working on for a book that will either be called Music is First Philosophy or maybe Thinking Musically, with the subtitle either Developing Variations on the Phenomenology and Cybernetics of Musical Ideas, or perhaps Developing Variations on the Theme of Expression in Phenomenology and Cybernetics. So this is a work in process. I haven't set this out to publishers yet, but I'm in the process of doing so. Well, I did send an earlier version out to a couple, but wasn't successful. So I'm interested in any feedback. So without any further ado, here is my summary. Music is the closest thing we have to a universal language. And yet, unfortunately, it is neither a language nor universal. Quite evidently, music is an effective and primordial form of communication. How is it that music can make us feel sorrow, joy, excitement, or calm? They can even make us feel new feelings we have never felt before. Much of Western music uses a pre-established language of tonality, things like tonic and dominant function, and major and minor polarity being the two most obvious, ubiquitous patterns. It is evident that a large part of musical perception is enculturated and learned. Indeed, it often takes time to get used to a new genre or composer. But at the same time, people leap across all these boundaries in some mysterious way, for the time being, as the event of music unfolds. While sharing a profound musical experience, it's as if we all hear and feel something roughly the same and participate in the same activity, a communion of spirits. How can music be universal and communicative on the one hand, and yet particular and ineffable? Musicians and philosophers continue to make both claims. It is communicative and it is ineffable. Can it be both? Today, it's typical to hear musicians take the extreme nominalist view, assuming that sounds are somehow value neutral, and that all content structuring and every emotional association is merely conventional or even brainwashing. Unpacking a response to this problem will give me the occasion to introduce some of the main themes in the book. To that end, I'll look briefly at three core nodes within the complex web of overlapping questions by which this book is composed: expression, musical ideas, and the role of metaphor in metaphysics. I'll conclude by gesturing to the organization and scholarly contributions of the book. Expression. An answer to this ancient and persistent question about musical experience lies in the phenomenology of gestural signification, understood as a relation between content and expression. In spoken language, content has a relative independence from expression, as for example saying, "Oh sure," "Oh sure," can convey vastly different meanings in different contexts by changing inflection. I will go so far as to suggest that by distinguishing between content and expression, we can find the universality of musicality within the relation that holds between content and expression as the formal component found in all music. The content, think things like harmonic and rhythmic patterning, and the expression, think things like timbre, style, the feel of playing. They're each culturally shaped, and the analysis of their concrete features shows us that we cannot establish any universal musical structures that would form the syntax of a universal language. In fact, diverse musical genres and traditions, when approached from outside, which often means not hearing them regularly as a child, but approaching them from outside requires a period of familiarization, where we learn to attune to the unique linguistic characteristics. But despite this fact, there's a prethetic, often nearly unconscious intent to make content and expression converge in musical form, which is just to say the effort one makes to play the sounds musically, with feel, with finesse, which is related to the familiarity of the audience, whatever that looks like to the people participating in the experience. For example, what caused surprise in the progressive rock music of people like Frank Zappa and the band Yes, was often some harmony, instrumentation, or technique that would be unsurprising to people outside of the music industry of 1960s and 70s in the US and the UK. So the context is indispensable to the way content and expression relate without being determined by the context. To understand musical forms and their unique modes of communication, we must investigate them phenomenologically and cybernetically in the activity of music making. We will find that music is not only our most primordial and persistent form of communicating about existence, but that it is the embryonic genesis point of all of our creativity, including especially philosophy. It is by harboring an embryonic potentiality, what's called plasticity, that our brain persists in being able to reinvent itself. It is by kindling musicality as primordial communications of existence that philosophy can make advancements. While expression is central to several 20th century continental philosophers who have inspired this study, the origin of the philosophy of expression is found in Spinoza and Leibniz. Expression is a relation and processual aspect of reality, whereby every existence is shaped by its perspectival embeddedness in the whole. It is also an aesthetic activity, the gathering of multiplicity into a togetherness, bringing otherness into community, which is only done by creatively organizing. The model from which this or concept was derived for Leibniz was perception, aesthesis, which always implies the sense of togetherness of multiplicity. The whole universe is the content. We all perceive the same whole, but only from a perspective. And our perspective emerges through expression in which we perceive multiplicity as coherently organized. It's not just a togetherness of the sensible, but the implicit togetherness of perspective itself, an intersensible existence like Merleau-Pontian flesh. Expression, starting from this Leibnizian concept, is the attunement of the sensible and relational, a phenomenological ontology that places aesthetics in the heart of metaphysics or ontology. Bergson, Whitehead, Merleau-Ponty, others who we will draw from in this book are all adopting and innovating ideas based on this philosophy of expression via the phenomenology of attunement. In other words, they are creating developing variations. Next section, musical ideas. Music has never been a mere pleasure of entertainment, although it doesn't resist becoming so from time to time. Music involves diverse forms of knowledge and creates ideas of its own that cannot be conveyed in words. A musician is an artist with technical knowledge, not necessarily in the sense of being able to explain the theory or teach someone else how to play. A musician need not know the physics of how the sound is being made in order to expressively manipulate its timbre. While a curiosity about how musical sounds are produced seems to be part of the musical spirit more broadly, all a musician needs is a sense of technique, constraining their action, making it precise so that they can articulate a form. The musician, as performer, selects at each moment the appropriate expressive dynamisms to enhance the musical content. Now louder, now softer, now faster, and so on, and with the subtlest touch. Already here, a most ancient pastime, we have a very subtle and profound idea at work, that one can be musically expressive, by aligning and contrasting different techniques at different times and making all of these variations work together towards a more expressive performance in the cohesive sense of its duration. This idea, born from the activity of music making, will often grow into a vocation or a calling, an ideal aspired after, what Schoenberg called developing variation. This musical idea is the shared ideation of what musical composition itself consists of. In the final analysis, composition involves repeating things that one has already heard. Tonalities, rhythms continue a tradition. But at the same time, to compose something new means going beyond the past, forming a new perspective on it. This leads to so many musicians across history trying to find a new sound, style, or genre, to invent new instruments, concocting raw novelty. Arguably, it's never fully novel. This leads to a new, generative, and evolving form of repetition, variation. The idea of variation was realized at the micrological level in composition, with the pattern growing endlessly new sounding, beautiful patterns which are produced all from a small number of relatively simple rhythmic and melodic content called motives. Developing variation, at the end of the day, is a subtle art of steering, piloting a multiplicity of movements to synergize them in an ensemble that is more than the sum of the parts by forming a whole in duration. Cybernetics, which gets its name from steering and piloting, is less a design philosophy than an adaptive problem solving that improvises on the fly with the shifts of the current and which is made graceful by finesse and a knowledge in the hands. Musical ideas are the style of movement animating the flesh of nature, as the late Merleau-Ponty called it, while professionalism and institutionalization have placed philosophy in an ivory tower, causing it to lose touch with the currents of everyday life. This melding of phenomenology and cybernetics maintains philosophy as a way of life. Now, what I do in this book that has not been done in scholarship is to connect the phenomenology of musical ideas, movement, and style centered in Merleau-Ponty with the idea of developing variations from Schoenberg, situated in Bergsonian metaphysics, Simondonian cybernetics, and a Machian Whiteheadian cosmology, placing them in a productive tension. Bridging these approaches uncovers a metaphysical and cosmological perspective born of one's own concrete phenomenological engagement with musical expression, in which music itself becomes philosophical and philosophy becomes musical. This culminates in the ethical and political questions surrounding what we are going to have to do to shape the future in order to flourish in earthly community. Weaving historical analysis, interpretation, and original insights as a phenomenologist, musician, and composer, I make an effort to conceive aesthetic experience afresh and as fundamental to existence by reviving and building on thinkers like Bergson, Merleau-Ponty, Sienkiewicz, Whitehead, and Simondon. The themes are developed in a narrative arc that connects philosophical concepts with illuminating musical examples and concrete practices in both phenomenology and musicology. Not just talking about something from and within the ivory tower, but making ideas come to life as a way of life. Next section, metaphor and metaphysics. I contend that we can satisfactorily understand aesthetic experience by framing it in terms of movement, and that we must take aesthetic feeling as fundamental to consciousness, life, and philosophy. Theory is only useful if developed by simultaneously deepening our perceptual, affective, and embodied sensitivity and motricity. Aesthetic experience is a movement that attends to and enriches other movements in sympathetic resonance. This fundamental property of tonal sound and harmony, sympathetic resonance, implies feedback loops among a multiplicity of movements that intensifies and develops in duration. Our ability to habituate and perfect our motricity into graceful and stylish movement is a precursor to doing philosophy. Gestures, which are the mundane and primordial form of aesthetic experience, form the basic and pervasive layer of expression in the meaningful movements of our bodies. Without gestural meaning, musical perception would never exist. Inversely, gestural meaning has a subtle dance-like musicality to it, and like musicality, it lends an added dimension of depth to mannerisms and individuations. The metaphors we live by are, first of all, the embodied musical ideas that are a slurry of sensations, feelings, and memories, not the controlling relation of representations dominated by thoughts. Metaphors can produce unrestricted forms of expression that are unbounded by coherence, participating in nonsense and fantasy. Phenomenology and Bergsonian metaphysics require a methodological relation to metaphor. Think of it this way. Only certain metaphors accurately describe the reality of metaphor itself, either logically or phenomenologically. On this level of sense-making, life's dynamic adaptability to multiplicity, attunement, is already melodic and rhythmic. While Merleau-Ponty discloses the metaphoric operation in all sense-making, Leonard Bernstein shows the metaphoric operation of all musical form. The continuity and repetition of movements in organisms become vital functions preserving life. Musical forms develop in an organic system bridging conscious and unconscious forces in a concerted motion. It is the very form of animal life with its orchestration of behaviors, milieus, or as Deleuze called them, refrains. The system of affects structures the flows of energy and informs them and tends towards regularity. Structuring is metastable and perseveres only by adapting. Living continuity is the melody that repeats by means of variation. Life and music converge to form the or concept of existence itself. What are we to make of this metaphoric system of mirrors sending the ray of our consciousness into the depths of expression in order to understand our existence? These movements, the rhythms of life, its orchestrated and concerted movements, are continuous with the expressive movements which produce and background our interpretation of musical sounds. The harmony and rhythm of melody remains in small ranges that reflect the limitations of the human voice. The pace of rhythm is related to speeds of walking or tapping one's fingers. Musical meaning is felt synesthetically in the body. Melody is an organismic patterning made possible by a proportionate structuring of harmony and rhythm, which comes to life with the expressive gesture. A basic feature of human life consists of enjoying and seeking to emulate movements. This is especially true of graceful movements, which produce pleasure and regularity. We spontaneously love and care for movements that sustain and enrich our lives and our place in the cosmos. This love of life as a sacred thing needed to be kindled and grieved. In its most basic form is the musicality or depth of movement. The love of movement, experiencing, participating in, or steering movement. In a word, the intelligent and embodied energy of care is the most fundamental aesthetic affect, as it is the form of our lived duration, and it is a developmental elaboration on the movement of life itself. Final section, contribution and organization. This book is an interdisciplinary, imaginative, experimental, and theoretical adventure into the experience of music. I weave science, mythology, philosophy, and various practices of sound aesthetics with the goal of forming a coherent view of the whole of musical experience and its import on aesthetics overall. Above all, it's to insist on the dependence of philosophy and ethics on musical experience, drawing on the science of harmonics, musicology, music theory, the phenomenology of music, and process philosophy. I integrate diverse disciplines to construct a system of speculative philosophy in Whitehead's sense. A novel attempt to coherently account for a multiplicity of facts held in tension and contrast, connecting all the details in a way that harmonizes them and forms a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. The philosophy of aesthetics is itself an act of creativity and invention, and philosophers should not neglect the aesthetic dimension of its own production. Any theory of beauty itself ought to be beautiful. Grace and elegance can describe ways of thinking which mix both wit and depth. Since the central theme of this phenomenological and cybernetic aesthetics is movement, beauty is at work in philosophy itself in the movements and transformations it facilitates. The introduction begins by presenting Bergson's idiosyncratic view of matter, which he calls images, and which ends up teaching us a great deal about perception, attention, and how we interact with matter as living beings. Bergson's revolutionary view of matter was lauded by the likes of Merleau-Ponty, Deleuze, Simondon, and ought to be central to musicology today. Bergson understands the reality of images and therefore of matter on the basis of analogies to musical sounds and experience. Counterintuitive as it sounds, it is auditory images, not visual, that are most revealing to his novel definition of matter via the moving image of musical sounds. Unlike Descartes' dead, inert extension, which cannot communicate with the substance of mind, matter, for Bergson, is rich with all the qualitative nuances we find immediately in our senses. Unlike materialists or eliminativists, for Bergson, matter is not unlike consciousness. There is no bifurcation of nature into subjective feelings and objective mechanism. Matter is a highly tensed, contracted form of consciousness. Sensation is not the mechanical impact, but a sympathetic connection to the inner tension in the sensible. This is made obvious in musical tonality, where the sounds have pitches of a determinate intensity. To listen to the tone, we tune into its unique frequency, and with harmonic complexity of a chord, its patterned relationality. Body and memory intermingle to form an image. Take the example of pitch memory, which is when we can identify or produce a precise note value without having perfect pitch. Perfect pitch means identifying or producing exact pitches automatically without effort. Pitch memory takes effort, imagination, and practice. One effective method is to learn the sounds of a few common chords on a guitar, if you're a guitar player. One uses memory to find their bearings from which to determine other tones by identifying the interval. So, in order to recall a common pitch, something like C, E, A, G, D, it helps to form the shape of one's hand and imagine you are actually playing the chord on the guitar. The tonal image envelops not only the sensation of pitch, but is implanted in an attitude of the whole body. Enacting the strumming helps to strengthen the memory image, which becomes a quasi-hallucinatory audio-motor image. The images are movements, and as such, are always incomplete, revising themselves and being modified in relation to one's body and memory. But movements have intentional continuity and interiority, prehensive or felt cohesion. They are idiomotor insofar as they envelop a dimension of depth through habit and memory. This profound view of matter through images vitiates the rest of the book and traces the underpinnings of a new philosophy of music and a phenomenological musicology that escapes the dilemma of nominalism, Platonism, realism, idealism, and the whole problem of sense, today called The Meaning Crisis by John Vervaeke. Each chapter unfolds different themes rooted in classical metaphysical problems connected to monumental terms: teleology, idea, intellect, infinity, time, metaphor. Each chapter approaches its theme from the perspective of an integrative, phenomenological cybernetics of music making, and engages contemporary musical logical questions, especially those related to the affective associations with modality and tonality and the idea of developing variation. This book is as much an inquiry in musicology and philosophy as it is an instruction manual on how to philosophize musically, as Jan Kelevich adaptly described it. The reader will not merely entertain ideas, but will be led to engage in their own musical practice of listening and expressing. It is in the purely sensible world of music that the idea of developing variation arose, and we can only think this idea by listening to music and experiencing it as a style of being that we can participate in. The scholarship from which I draw spans contemporary sources in musicology, phenomenology, process philosophy, cybernetics, and continental philosophy, including Jessica Wiskus, Judith Jones, Michael Gallup, David Morris, Ted Toadvine, Leonard Lawler, Veronique Fauti, John Majorca, Vieja Iyer, George Lakoff, Mark Johnson, Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, Eleanor Roosh, Arnold Schoenberg, and Leonard Bernstein. Despite the heavy list of scholarly influences, the style of the book is not that of academic history of philosophy, comparing and contrasting different theories, reconstruction of arguments, clarifying and passing judgment on all the secondary literature via polemics. Instead, I conduct a continuous development in this new way of thinking about music, making it make sense for those not necessarily familiar with these minor traditions. The goal is to orchestrate the movements of many different thinkers together in concert and counterpoint, remaining always in touch with the concrete examples. To this end, I develop several lines of thought, one drawing from Bergson, another from Whitehead, Spinoza, Rouillet, or Kant, and by making them converge in an aesthetic theory that harmonizes analysis and intuition, the materiality with the spirituality of music, the cerebral with the emotional and embodied, rigor with sincerity. Above all, I want the reader to feel the pulse of this magnificent and inspiring view of music and philosophy as a way of life, open to our developing variations. Contents and chapters. Preface: music is first philosophy. Introduction: practicing attunement. Definitions of the affects. And then begins the chapters. First, the organization of sensation, Bergson, Mach, and the Gestalten. Chapter 2, a musical idea, Schoenberg and developing variations. Chapter 3, beauty in motion, charm, grace, style. Chapter 4, teleology and the ends of music. Chapter 5, thinking and the musical, ratio, continuity, integration. Chapter 6, phenomenology of infinity, materiality and vibrance. Chapter 7, inventions, time, eternity, possibility. And Chapter 8, music, metaphor, and metaphysics.